All right. We're up and running there. Okay. Excellent. Welcome, everyone. All right. All right. So, I had said a couple of weeks ago at the beginning of February, I had put out a post on social that said I was going to do not one but two live Q&As during this month. And I didn't do the first one. And I'll tell you, the reason why I didn't do it is I got sick. I was out with like a horrible cold, almost lost my voice. It was absolutely horrible. So I apologize for anyone who was hoping that I was going to do a Q&A live a couple of weeks ago. I can see the cough still hanging out with me. But we are doing it today. So there were a couple people who had direct messaged me with some different questions that they were hoping that I was going to be able to talk about. So I've put a couple of those right here just in my slides to remind myself what all the questions are. But I'm also happy to try and figure out how to double check all the comments while I'm doing this all simultaneously. And so if there are any specific questions that are coming up or follow-up things or anything like that, feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat area. However you guys are putting in those comments. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. Got some good questions. One of the first questions had to do with sharing tips about explaining test results. This is one I have to tell you, I continue to work on. I have been in this field for over 20 years as a school psychologist, doing lots of different jobs within that field, trying my hand at administration for a while. And I have to tell you, it's just something I'm still working on. It's just something that I'm still trying to figure out some different techniques that make me feel like the parents are getting the information they need to make an informed decision, but not going on and on and on and on and on. And this is interesting because when I think about when I explain test results at a meeting at a public school, like I got my school psych hat on, versus when I'm explaining test results, some of you know I also have a small private practice. I have to tell you, sometimes my private practice one-on-one meetings with families are the same amount of time as like a typical IEP meeting would be, except we don't have any of the IEP-ness in my private practice, right? Like we don't have to fill out paperwork. No one has to sign anything. We don't all have to come up with goals and all of those types of things. We're just explaining results and talking about next steps and recommendations. But sometimes I spend just as much time talking about the results as I would as a school psychologist in an entire meeting, going through the entire meeting. Right? Because most of the time we don't have 3 hours for IEP meetings to explain every single test result. So I always feel like I'm trying to figure out this really nice balance between, I don't want to be here forever. I don't want everyone's eyes to glaze over, but at the same time, I want everyone to feel really informed. So I will tell you on my best weeks, that parent has the report ahead of time. I have to tell you, especially for my families who have the skills and abilities to review all that information. And I just say that because I work with a lot of bilingual families and we don't usually have a translated copy of the report ahead of time. So when I have those situations where parents are able to review it ahead of time, I think it's amazing. I think it really helps me because then I'm able to summarize a little bit more and I know they've already read through all the stuff. That can be really, really helpful. But when I think about explaining test results, I think one of the things that as I've been sharing with others, for those of you who don't know, I get to do lots of trainings with school psychologists in different school districts, and I also host a couple of memberships for school psychologists. I do one about the pattern of strengths and weaknesses model, and I also have one called the Prepared School Psych Community, and we've been talking about this this school year. And so one of the words I've been trying to use a lot is the word succinct. right? How do we explain test results succinctly? And I think when I use that term for myself, it's really reminding me to tell the team, what did I learn about the student? And I don't always need to tell them every single itty bitty thing I learned. What did I learn, right? And I'm ready. If anyone has any follow-up questions, if anyone wants data, evidence, any of that, it's all in my report. I'm ready to go. But when I'm explaining those test results verbally at a meeting, I'm trying to figure out, what is it that I want to tell this family about what I learned about their student in whatever, section I'm discussing, whether it's the cognitive processing section, or if I'm talking about the social emotional section, or adapt, what does it all mean, right? And I feel like that is a good perspective for me, is taking on that role of, yes, in my report, every piece of data is in there, but out loud, what does it all mean? Right? And I used to do this with my interns when they were ready for it. And I used to say, I want you to come ready to talk with me about what you learned about the student. And I only want you to use 10 sentences. And you're not allowed to use a number, a name of a test, or words like average or below average. No qualitative descriptors. Just what did you learn about this student? And I think that's really, really hard, because for most of us, that's not how we were trained in our programs. It might have been for you, but I was trained to talk at a really high jargon level, right? And you get out of grad school and it takes you a really long time to get comfortable with all that jargon. And so for me to be able to explain my test results without using all that jargon, I had to become really comfortable with what does fluid reasoning mean, right? So that I don't have to use that word. Or if I do use that word, that I can quickly follow that up with a very parent-friendly explanation for that term, right? So for me, it's been becoming really comfortable with the jargon, and then really thinking about, what did I learn about the student? How do I want to explain that? And one of the things that I've had the opportunity to do over the last couple of years that I really didn't in the early part of my career was mainly assigned to elementary schools. And now I'm helping out in a school district where I'm actually helping out more at the high school level. So I have a lot more students at my meeting. And I have to tell you, that's been really helpful for me, because a lot of times when people ask about what do I mean by parent friendly, I'm like you could explain it to a high school student, right? I'm probably not using the word fluid reasoning with a high school student unless I'm following that up with, this is what I mean by this fancy term here, right? And so that's been a really helpful perspective for me, is if I had to explain it to the student, what kind of information do I want to share with that student? How do I want to bring it all together, right? So I would say any sort of tips for this would be, write out what you learned about the student, right? Without using, what did I say? No numbers, no test names, no qualitative descriptors, just what did you learn about the student? Because we did this evaluation and we looked at every piece of paper in this child's cumulative record, and we talked to all these people who filled out 9 million forms for us, what did it all mean to me, instead of having to go through bit by bit by bit? And that's been helping me in those instances where I feel like that's how I want to kind of take on this verbal explanation at a meeting. So those would be my couple of tips for that. I hope that's helpful. All right, next question up. If the student is passing their classes, do they require special ed? Right? So we know eligibility for special ed has a couple of different parts to it, right? They have to meet criteria for one of our areas of eligibility. It has to be impacting their educational performance, and then they have to require special education or need special education, right? Kind of see both of those terms a lot in regulation language. So I think that's a really interesting conversation, because you can have students who have different ways that their brain is processing and remembering information who might not require special education, right? Those of us who have tested hundreds, thousands of kids, a lot of kids have strengths and weaknesses within their learning profiles. I have strengths and weaknesses within my own learning profile. Just because I found something doesn't automatically mean that a student requires special education, right? And sometimes I find that teams might use the word benefit, right? I think the child would benefit from special ed. And I always have to remind my teams, like, that's not what the requirement, though, is, right? It says requires or needs special education. And so what I found to be really interesting when we think about kids passing classes is the whole idea about how grades are given. It's so interesting to me being a part of so many different districts and really getting an opportunity to look at report cards, at the elementary level versus middle school, high school level. A lot of districts that I have worked with at the elementary level, they're very standards based, meaning like they'll say like 1, 2, 3, 4, exactly how they're progressing towards standards. And a lot of times when I've worked at those schools, my third grade teachers know that in order to get a 3 for this standard, the kid has to demonstrate this. And if not, it's a 2. And if not, it's a 1. But sometimes when I get into places that use letter grades, I find it's really interesting sometimes to have conversations about how grades are given out. Because in my mind, I keep thinking they're standards based. And that isn't always what I have found. So I have to be careful when I just look at grades to see if a child requires special education, because grades are given for a variety of different reasons. I was working at a middle school once where what was found out is that grades were given based on effort. Had nothing to do with if they're meeting standards or not. I actually had an elementary school that at 4th grade, we started giving letter grades. And at one of my elementary schools, I had all these 4th grade teachers coming to meetings and wanting to refer kids for evaluations. And I was struggling because I'm like, but the kid's getting all C's. And on this report card, a C means meeting grade level expectations. Like, but you keep saying out loud that they're behind. And so I'm confused. And they're like, oh, yeah. We allow all of our kids to be able to retake a test in order to get a D or F grade. And if they retake the test, which is open book, they can bring their grades up to a C. So that grade on that report card is actually not reflective of the first time they took their test. And I said, excellent, that's fine. That's a great, glad that you have that opportunity for kids to learn the information. I have nothing against that. But where on the report card are you telling the person that that's how this grade was created? Because otherwise I look at it and it says a C means meeting grade level expectations. So I have really found that especially when we're using letter grades, we have to really be understanding about how those grades are given and what they're based on. I have other times that homework is such a huge part of a student's grade. And I have kids who definitely know the content. They pass tests. They just don't ever do homework. So they're getting failing grades, but it's because they're not doing homework. And that might not be a learning disability. It's more of a homework disability. And right now that's not an area of eligibility for special ed. So I think all those kind of things are things I keep in the back of my head when I think about just looking at grades. Right, is really what goes into those grades. And we know that we never ever make decisions based on any single piece of data, right? So that's why we look at performance in class as well as grades, as well as teacher test and CBMs and all of those different things, and that we just never make decisions based solely on one single thing. But if you've never had a conversation at your school site about how grades are actually decided upon, I highly encourage you. It'll be something fun to do in February. It might make you sad, though. It made me sad sometimes at some of my schools. So I think it's, for some students, grades are a helpful piece of data all the time. But how that grade is, created, decided upon, I think is an important understanding if we're ever going to look at that information there. Okay. Couple more questions to look at. How do I keep up with my emails? I think it's a great question as a school psychologist. I'd be really curious on how all of you would answer this question. As I was creating this slide, I had this little email little icon, and I was going to move it up because it was blocking it. But actually, the way that it looks like someone's in jail inside. And that's how I feel sometimes with email. Like I just feel like I just can be completely trapped by email. I could spend just days responding to emails and going back and forth about emails with people. And never get anything else accomplished, right? So, couple of different tips I'm going to give you that have worked for me. Number one, I have to turn off all the beeps and buzzes and notifications and everything, because what I know about our brain is our brain sees a notification or hears a bell going off, and our brain loves novelty. And so we have to look at it. We just have to look at it. Like, what is it? Right? Like someone's emailing us like our school just won the lotto, right? And you don't have to come to work ever again. That's that's that hope. And instead it's like, there's another parent request for evaluation, right? Like, so you don't want that even, right? You don't need to know that right then and there. So number one, I turn off all notifications. The other thing I know about myself is even on my phone, I have an iPhone, I had to turn off the bubble. Right? The little bubble that shows up that tells you how many emails, because otherwise I would just look at my phone for some other reason, like I'm trying to use the age calculator or something. And I would see the bubble and have to look at it. I have to make the bubbles go away. I know not everyone has it. I have people in my life, it says 2,535 emails in their bubble. That hurts me inside. I can't do that. So you got to know yourself, right? The other thing that I have found to be very, very helpful for me, and I started this, maybe I tried it last school year too. I use Gmail. In my Gmail, I have folders, like we all do, like most of us do. And I started putting a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday weekend folder. And I labeled them 01, 02, 03, and so forth, so that they go to the top of my folder list. And then as I'm reviewing emails, I am putting them in the folder of the day that I'm going to look at it. Now, way back when I first started in this field, I had 3 elementary schools. And I felt like at the time I had some pretty good boundaries with my schools. Like they knew, like they could email me whenever they wanted, but like I'm probably not going to respond to it until it's my day there, unless it's a crisis or something. And so thinking about when I had that kind of opportunity, those folders would have been really helpful because I could see it in my inbox, but I would just put it in like, oh, that's my Wednesday school. So I would just go ahead and put it in my Wednesday folder, and then it's right there for me, and it's ready to go when I get there on Wednesday. So one of the things that has been really helpful for me, and yes, I do have a weekend folder. The weekend folder, I try not to look at a lot of work emails, but those are a free training PAR is doing or something else that I don't have any other time in my day to look at. I put those in my weekend folder. The other thing that I have found to be really helpful is I try not to look at my email too often, because even though there's no dings going on, I just see that new ones are there and they're highlighted. I need to look. So what I tend to do is I will come in first thing in the morning and I will go through my inbox. I am a 0 inbox person. That's my goal every day, is to leave my office and there's nothing in my inbox. It is either dealt with or it's in a folder for when I'm going to deal with it. And so I'll come in the morning and I will look through everything. And if it's something super quick that I can do right then and there, I will respond to it. Or my favorite button, schedule send. If I'm looking at email at 7 o'clock in the morning, no one else needs to know that I'm responding then, right? Because then you might respond back to me. How about I send that at 8:15, right? I was doing that this morning. I was like, oh, I already sent them an email. Okay, this one will go in at 1 o'clock. Right? I was schedule sending them, right? But if it's going to take anything more than a couple of quick seconds, then it goes into an email folder, right? So this morning, what's today? Today is Wednesday. So I went in and looked at everything and I either responded to it, deleted it because it was probably junk, or it went into my Wednesday folder. And then I have a time set aside in my day where I look at email and respond to email. That's the time I have set aside that I'm like, nope, this is what I'm focusing on and I'm getting through my email. And sometimes I go through it and I'm like, actually, it wasn't that important and I'm not getting it to today. So you get to go in my Thursday folder and we'll cross our fingers tomorrow's a little bit better, right? I try and have my time of the day to look at the email kind of closer to the end of my day. If I had like an end of the day IEP meeting, I would just kind of put it before that, right? Because I don't want to come back after an IEP meeting and then have 45 emails to review and respond to. So that's been something that's been really helpful for me. It's just a quick way to scan through. So even if I look at it really quickly throughout the day, I can also just quickly scan through it and do my sorting. That's been really, really helpful for me. And I've really been working on that over the last couple of weeks. I was actually in a Zoom meeting with a district I'm going to be working with, and the director of special ed actually said out loud that she only looks at email first thing in the morning and at 5:30 at night. She's like, if you need to get a hold of me, these are the ways to get a hold of me, but don't send me an email and think I'm going to get to you that day. I'll get to you like later on that day. And I was like, the director of special ed said that? I think I could try that too, right? So it's something that I tried on. It's been working. It doesn't happen every single day. Sometimes I look at it, but I have to tell you, a lot of times I go in first thing in the morning and I scroll through it and then I exit out of email and I don't open it again until I need something in my email. And then I exit out of it again. Otherwise, you just see that little thing in that little tab, right? And you're like, I got to touch it. I got to see what happens. Right? All right, couple more questions to go through. How are we doing on time? We're doing good on time. Okay. Can the IEP team override the school psychologist when it comes to eligibility? I don't know if you all saw my post. I actually talked about this a little bit ago in one of my social posts. I remember a couple of years ago, I was contracting with the district. I was doing a lot of support for their new hires and their school psychologist. And one of the school psychologists asked me this question. They're like, could you go and find out where it says in IDA or our state's regulation language that it's the school psychologist that gets to make decisions about eligibility? And I was like, I'll look for that, but I don't remember ever seeing that in my lifetime. And of course, nowhere in IDA does it say one human being on the team gets to be in charge of that decision, right? What is it always says, right? A team of qualified professionals and the parent make decisions about this, right? So no, I could not find that special thing that group wanted me to find, which was the school psychologist was in charge of that. However, what does eligibility say, right? Going back to something we talked about before, eligibility is you have to meet the criteria. That's the first thing, right? You have to meet criteria. It has to impact your educational performance and you have to require special ed, right? Those are the three components of like every area of eligibility. So in some eligibility areas, so for example, like an orthopedic impairment or a hearing impairment, as a school psychologist, I'm probably not the one in charge of saying the kid has a disability. Like a doctor or an audiologist is probably telling me like this kid has a visual impairment. All right, check, criteria met for that. But it's now our team's responsibility to make sure and look at the other two prongs, right? This kid has an orthopedic impairment. Okay, I'm not questioning that. However, what's the impact on the kid's educational performance and does the child require special ed? Because just because you have an orthopedic impairment doesn't automatically mean you meet the other two criteria, right? So that's going to be part of that team discussion there. But what comes up a lot more, and I don't know about all of you, I hear about it a lot when we're talking about kids with major emotional and behavioral issues. So I practice in California. We don't have behavior disorder. We just have emotional disturbance. And there's definitely instances I hear that like the principal wants to override and say, I don't care what you just said, I think the kid's ED. And then the rest of the team tries to get on board and vote. Like it's a voting type of thing that we do. The school psych is like, what are you talking about? You have to meet one of the 5 criteria and then all the 3 limiting criteria, right? You have to meet that criteria. So there can be differences of opinions about criteria, and I am the first one to raise my hand that say most of our criteria is super vague in its language. So sometimes we need to fully explain to the rest of our team members, like, This is what the criteria means. This is how we're looking at it. These are all the data sources I looked at. But can the team override the school psychologist? I think it depends on what is the school psychologist saying. And is there any other data that's being brought up at the meeting, right? Because I know most of us write in our reports, like we'll have a discussion about eligibility, and then we always say something like, all final decisions are deferred to the IEP team, right? And I'm thinking about a meeting I did a number of years ago, still right there in my brain, where our team was kind of coming in and was going to say no to eligibility. Like all the data points that we had collected was a no. And then during the IEP meeting, the parent and the child was there as well, the student was there, had actually shared information that they, for some reason, decided not to share with us during the timeline process. And so based on the new information, we did make a different decision. Right? So it wasn't that the team was overwriting, but new information was made available that the team then had to take into consideration, right? So that's something I always think about too is there information that all of a sudden someone's sharing if, like, going back to one of the other questions, one of the things we're like, but he's passing all his classes. And then in the middle of the meeting, we're like, well, this is how grades are done in this school. Right? Hopefully I'm not waiting until an IEP meeting in the middle of an IEP meeting to have that discussion and learn that information. But if all of a sudden that's when I find it out, I might make a different decision, right? Based on what that information shares with me, right? But there's nothing that I have ever been able to find from a legal perspective that says that a school psychologist is like, the final say. However, we typically are, other than speech and language impairment, the person at the IEP meeting that has the most knowledge about eligibility criteria, right? So again, I think it's important to think about, where is that disagreement? Is it a lack of understanding about the super vague eligibility criteria? Is there new information someone is thinking about? Other than a parent possibly disagreeing, I will say if the rest of my team is kind of disagreeing, I hope I know about that before I walk into that meeting, right? If I think this is going to be a little interesting, if I'm thinking about another case I was in where the kid had been under emotional disturbance and I was going to come to the meeting and go, I don't think so anymore. And I knew my admin would be a little frustrated with me. So we had a conversation ahead of time and we went through all the reasons why, and to make sure we're all on the same page so it didn't come out in the middle of the meeting. Right? So those are my best tips for those kind of situations here. One last question. I'm just going to go in and see if I see any questions I don't see anything in our chat here. And I have to tell you, just reading this question, I knew this was a California school psychologist. So which SLD processing disorder do you think orthographic processing falls under? So why do I know it's a California school psychologist, or I'm almost certain, is because California is one of only about 5 or 6 states that really specifically says, this is what we mean by processing disorders. This is what we mean by basic psychological processes. And most other states are just you just say what the words are, right? In California, we're here's the list. And so exciting about our list, we have words that aren't even commonly used, and there are no definitions for the words, right? Whoever wrote those words a bazillion years ago, never once anywhere do we have information about what did they intended by some of these words they gave us, like association and conceptualization, right? So I get this question a lot when I do trainings in California because I do a lot of conversation about dyslexia. And this one always comes up in California. And part of my answer is it depends. Because it depends on how you're defining the California processing terms. Because I've heard different people give different answers. I've had people say I think it goes under visual processing because that's kind of a visual part of reading, right? The ability to remember the sequence of letters. So there's obviously that visual component there. And other people are I put it under association. And I'm well, how do you define association? And they tell me, and then it makes total sense why they would put orthographic processing under there. But that might not be how I'm defining association or the psychologist sitting next to me. So one of the things I always say to my California school psychs is, it needs to make sense to you because you might possibly have to defend your report, right? So it always needs to make sense to you, right? That's going to be the important piece here. Now, I want to give you 2 resources about orthographic processing here. And one of them, both of them are free. Yay, love free. So one of the resources I want to share with you is, if you go to my website, you see that right above my face here, jennyponzurek.com. Along the top under resources, it'll say something like Facebook Live resources or something like that, social media lives, maybe it says that. And if you go to that page, there's a number of free resources that you can download. You just give me your name and email address and I'll send you an email with the information. And one of those is about orthographic processing. I had done some videos about orthographic processing and phonological processing, kind of how they work together. And then I found some cool videos on YouTube. And so if you are feeling like one of those people that just needs to hear some information about orthographic processing again, and you like the way I explain things, that is one resource for you. The second resource, and I didn't write it down on my screen, and I'm so sorry, I'm going to repeat it a couple of times here. Dr. Milton Dehn, D-E-H-N, has a website called schoolhouseeducationalservices.com. schoolhouseeducationalservices.com. And he, not too long ago, had Dr. Nancy Mather on, who's one of the co-authors of the TOC, Test of Orthographic Competence, 2nd edition. And if you want to listen to the replay, if you go to his tabs at the top where it says trainings and just click on there, he has access to a lot of replays of trainings. He has a lot of people come on and do trainings for him. The beginning part are all the paid ones. So you're welcome. There's some cool paid ones on there, but if you keep scrolling down, you'll find the free ones. And there you'll find the one by Nancy Mather. She, I was just listening to it. Actually, I was re-listening to it last weekend. Yes, that's what I do sometimes on the weekend, as I listen to trainings on orthographic processing, because when else am I supposed to have time to do that? But she's also has, you get the handout from the training, and she's got, I was like reviewing it today because I was preparing a training on dyslexia. She's got this really nice handout that you can download for free on his website that is also talks about orthographic processing and orthographic mapping versus orthographic knowledge versus orthography. And a lot of those words are newer to a lot of school psychologists. So I thought that the article did like a really nice job of explaining all of the different terms and then talking about the importance of orthography as it relates to reading. That's a lot of times we're talking about that under dyslexia, and also talking about how it relates, of course, to spelling as well. So again, you can find that on Dr. Milton Dehn, D-E-H-N, his website, schoolhouseeducationalservices.com. And then along the top, you click on trainings, and then scroll on down until you find the free ones, okay? And if you're listening to this and it's still February of 2023, because I just looked on it right before we did live, it is like the first one under the free because it's one of the most recent ones, okay? Great stuff. She's a great speaker. If you've never heard Nancy Mather speak, she's a wonderful speaker. So a lot of great information, but a lot of great information from the handout in the article as well, for those of you who might not have 90 minutes to listen to the whole webinar. So those were the questions that I got sent into me. So those are the ones that I wanted to share with all of you. Again, you can find a lot of great resources on my website. I talked about the ones, if you go to my website, jennyponzurek.com, under resources, there are some there. It says like social media lives. There's a bunch, 5 or 6 that you can just sign up. Just give me your name and email address. I'll send you an email with that information. You might want to also notice under resources the blog post. And one of the things that we've been talking about, which was one of the questions that came up in our first question here in our Q&A, was about explaining results. And I've done a couple of blog posts about this. So we talked about explaining results succinctly, and then I did a different one specifically about social emotional results, because sometimes depending on our evaluations, like sometimes when we're looking like at autism or something, it's like I've got maybe like a BASC and an autism rating scale and maybe the social responsiveness scale. Ooh, and then we got an ADOS in there. And we've got like all of this information and we're like, how do I talk about this, right? So there's a blog post about that, and almost every single one of my blog posts has like a free resource that goes along with it, either like a download or a quick video or something like that. So feel free to take a look at all of those. And then I will see you guys all next time. Again, my apologies for not doing the other Q&A earlier this month as I was ill. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. All right. I'm off to have dinner with my family. Bye, everyone.